Wyoming di Washington abita Christopher Hitchens, uno degli intellettuali di sinistra più importanti di questo paese, nonostante sia un britannico. Secondo la rivista di Washington, The Washingtonian, è uno dei pensatori più importanti di questa città. Secondo il Guardian, che è la Bibbia del leftism britannico, è uno dei pensatori più importanti di questo secolo. Hitchens è un uomo di sinistra, è un ex marxista, un ex trotskista, lo vedrete, dirà delle cose pazzesche su questo punto, però sulla guerra al terrorismo è uno dei più tosti, uno dei più grandi, secondo me più efficaci alleati della dottrina Bush. Lui sostiene, ed è la persona che ha inventato questa frase, che i terroristi islamici, i fondamentalisti alla Bin Laden, sono degli islamofascisti, cioè lui li considera la stessa stregua dei nazisti e dei fascisti. Vediamo un po' che cosa ha da dire.
Sei stato il primo a dire che i fondamentalisti musulmani in realtà sono fascisti islamici.
More or less right. Have we started?
Yeah,
Bravo. Very good. What I said in the week after September 11th was in my column in The Nation in New York, where I said what we saw in downtown New York and in Washington last week was fascism with an Islamic face. And you know the history of this observation, perhaps. Socialism with a human face, Susan Sontag re-quoting Dubček about Poland and saying communism with a fascist face or fascism with a human face. Anyway, it is as much as to say fascism, but I prefer the nuance. Now the word Islamofascism is used a little lightly, I think. But there are things in common, should I say what they are. A fanatical idea of mass mobilization, a cult of the leader, a cult of death, fortunately in some ways because it's self-destructive. It's just also true of fascism. It's irrational, in other words, as well as extremely violent. And a cult of worship of violence, for instance. Of course, without even mentioning it, a fanatical hatred of the Jewish people, and an attempt at the impossible, at the recreation of a lost, glorious past. In this case, the Caliphate. Well, these parallels are good enough, I think, to say that it's not vulgar to draw them.
Se è un dovere combattere la dittatura e il totalitarismo, mi spieghi perché in questo caso la sinistra ha abdicato al suo compito?
If you believe that the main enemy, or if you have taught yourself and tried to teach others, that the main enemy of humanity, the main enemy of human progress, is globalization, which in effect means the United States, you must mean it. That is the main enemy. Any challenger to it, therefore, must have something to be said for them.
Yeah.
And I know people who would say, look, Mr. Bin Laden is not Antonio Gramsci, but it's in a way better than no protest at all. or no movement against imperialism at all. I say you don't understand a word you're saying. You are yourself inviting a suicide pact with this. That's the first thing. The second, and I think it's the main thing, the second reason I believe it has a little more honor to it, perhaps, people have a bad conscience about the Palestinians. Over the years in Europe and in America, many people have learned that there is another people in the Holy Land. It's not just Israel. And they have developed sympathy and solidarity with them. Actually, the Palestinians are 20% Christian. And of those who are Muslim, many are not very, shall we say, fanatical about it. It's wrong to identify Palestine as a question for Muslims, as if it was a Muslim cause. But still, with these allowances made, that's part of the background, I believe. That's the positive side. On the non-positive side, there is an alarming increase in cultural anti-Semitism. I've noticed it everywhere. One of the more depressing things to have happened in my lifetime. There's a recrudescence of it. And many forms of anti-Americanism and anti-American propaganda are definitely poisoned with this tendency.
Tu hai scritto cose molto dure contro il movimento della pace. Hai scritto che in realtà non sono veri pacifisti, ma sono addirittura guerrafondai, gente che combatte sul fronte opposto.
That's correct.
Ce lo puoi spiegare?
It annoys me when I read lazy journalism, which is easy to come by. I'm probably in your country too, which refers to those who are opposed to the regime change policy of the president as anti-war. Well, this is true if they are pacifist, which none of them are. Of the ones I know, and I know most of them personally, it has to be said they are pro-war, actively pro-war, but on the other side. I'll give you an example from yesterday's New York Times. Mr. Ramsey Clark, who used to be the Attorney General of Lyndon Johnson, and who keeps mentioning this fact as if he should be proud of it. If I had been Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General, I would keep it a secret. I would change my name, I would have plastic surgery, I would leave the country. But he boasts of it. Well, he is probably if the anti-war movement in America has one single person as its voice and public leader, it's him. He turns up in Baghdad, he's a lawyer obviously, to join the defense team of Saddam Hussein. Okay, Saddam Hussein should have a good lawyer. I insist upon it. Saddam's lawyers have been saying on the first count in the indictment that he did not order the murder and torture of several hundred young men and boys in a Shia village outside Baghdad where an attempt had been made to assassinate him. They say this did not happen. Ramsey Clark turns up and says it should have happened. His first remark is, at this time Saddam Hussein was fighting a war with a Shia country, Iraq. You can't have assassination attempts, you have to be firm on these occasions. It could have been said by Graziani. Not to mention the fact that Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran, had begun that war, in which we think perhaps 1.5 million people were killed. Well, this is fascism. And it's from the leader of the American anti-war movement. It's a disgrace and nobody says anything about it. It's I who am supposed to explain myself. People say to me, are you serious? You think Saddam Hussein should have been overthrown? Are you mad? Are you wicked? Are you evil? Are you drunk? But Ramsey Clark, good man. Get in there. Justify atrocity, torture, genocide, aggression, dictatorship. With a pure conscience. My other well-known opponent, probably better known perhaps in Europe, is George Galloway, member of the British House of Commons, member of the Ba'ath Party, certainly paid member of the Ba'athist elite, and member of the Oil for Food clientele that was organized by Mr. Tariq Aziz, friend of the Pope, last Pope. Well, Mr. Galloway was recently in Syria, where he described all the bombings, executions, decapitations, blowing up of mosques, of the offices of the Red Cross, of the United Nations, and all these in Baghdad, as martyrdom operations, praised them all, and did this specifically as the guest of and defender of the human toothbrush figure of Bashar al-Assad, the cretinous little dauphin of Syria, the last Syrian Ba'athist leader, as it will soon turn out. Well, what am I to say about this? This is anti-war? This is socialism? This is liberalism? No, it's fascism. It's power worship. Worship of the most unbridled kinds of power by the most unpleasant kinds of people. But Mr. Galloway's press coverage says he's a maverick, he's a David confronting the American Goliath, that he's a dissident, which is a term of honor to me, that he was expelled from the Labour Party, of which I'm a member, for his opposition to the Iraq War. The Labour Party is full of people who are opposed to the Iraq War. George Galloway, as a matter of fact, was expelled from the Labour Party for advocating the shooting of British soldiers. That's a slightly different position from being critical of the Gulf War. So you see what one is up against, I mean, culturally and politically, and journalistically.
C'è qualcosa però che non mi è chiaro. Come mai in Europa la sinistra non capisce questo ragionamento che fai? George Orwell scriveva quello che scriveva, ma lo diceva da uomo di sinistra. E anche tu dici di essere di sinistra.
No, as a leftist. Well, not. Yes and no. I no longer have any political allegiance, certainly no party allegiance. I still think like a Marxist, I must say, and I probably always will. I would not easily say I was a socialist. I find that increasingly more and more meaningless claim. But the origin of my commitment in this case is this. For a long time, I've been a friend of the Iraqi and Kurdish left. All right. Kanan Makir, for example, who's one of the great Marxist intellectuals of the Middle East, was the intellectual author of, you might say he was the intellectual Dubček of the Saddam regime, in that he wrote the very precise anatomy of the Ba'athist state, showing its relationship to fascism and to Stalinism. President Jalal Talabani, the first elected president Iraq has ever had, is also the leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. The Patriotic Union of Kurdistan is the corresponding member of the Socialist International in the region. The Iraqi Communist Party, with which I have very little in common politically, took part in the transitional government, takes part in the electoral process, and has members in some of the organs and institutions of the new Iraq. It seems to me an elementary thing for a socialist is that he or she is an internationalist. One identifies with and expresses solidarity with one's comrades in other countries. In this case, no. The left in general describes not these brave rebels who I've just mentioned, who actually did form a people's army and did conduct a revolutionary struggle for many years now.
The real partisans.
The reil partisan, the partigiani. They prefer to reserve that term of honor for the forces of Mr. Zarqawi.
L'estrema destra, qui negli Stati Uniti, sostiene che tu sei un neoconservatore.
Yes, I've written an article for Bernard-Henri Lévy's magazine. Do you read French?
No, in effetti lo leggo, ma...
Well, I don't read it very well either. I certainly can't write it, but well translated. It's called La Règle du Jeu. It's a quarterly magazine published in Paris by Bernard-Henri Lévy, in which I entitled, Is It Possible to be a Neoconservative? Which they have called, I've seen now it's printed, Why I Am a Neoconservative. Never mind. In it, I'd probably have to just say yes. I mean, no one's going to listen to all the nuances. The first objection I would have is that I'm not a conservative of any kind. And that really
Forse anche i neocon.
The word neoconservative is a leftist coinage, originally as a joke, from actually a nice man called Michael Harrington. Yeah, who was a friend of these people and said, oh, you're just becoming neoconservatives. Eventually they agreed, you know, it had stuck somehow. But why people hate them is this, or hate us if you insist. Because we're so radical, because we said we're willing to risk a war with the status quo in the Middle East. And willing to take the chance on the change. We can't guarantee you peace, stability, prosperity as a result. We can say the status quo is insufferable, as well as unjust and unstable, and we need to take the risk of removing it. Well, that's not a conservative position by any definition, and it was that drew me to this group. Prior to that, it was a slightly easier allegiance in that the neoconservatives were part of the coalition that helped to rescue Bosnia and Kosovo from Greater Serbia and from the National Socialism of Mr. Milosevic, supported again by Ramsey Clark and George Galloway. That was, in a way, a more conservative position. I'm very glad that I took it. There were some of us on the left. There were many American Jews and many American Muslims. And there was the neoconservative group, which said, no, we cannot allow ethnocide in Europe, and we cannot allow the spread of ethnic cleansing on the borders of the European Union. It's a pragmatic question as well as a matter of principle.
Qui negli Stati Uniti c'era un presidente liberal e in molti paesi europei, come per esempio in Italia, c'erano governi di sinistra. Perché in questo caso è stato bombardato un paese straniero senza nessuna risoluzione delle Nazioni Unite?
Well, in that case, I think, well, of course it was known in advance, as it was known with Iraq, that at least one member country of the Permanent Five would veto an intervention. There was a different one in this case. It would have been probably China, and actually certainly Russia, but not France this time. That was known then, but it wasn't considered to be a sacred question. It wasn't considered to be an article of faith that you needed this. And remember also that it was the first year or so after the reunification of Europe and the fall of the wall. And the feeling was that Europe should take responsibility for its own actions, and that the permission to prevent the implosion of Yugoslavia or the takeover of Yugoslavia by National Socialism was a permission that was allowed within the existing self-defense rules of NATO. And I don't think any member state of the UN felt able to challenge that. In other words, it was not condemned either. Nor, of course, has the American and British coalition in Iraq been condemned by the United Nations. Indeed, the United Nations recognizes the Iraqi government as legitimate, which it is. That's something not many people understand.
La mattina dell'11 settembre del 2001 mi pare tu fossi a Seattle, nello stato di Washington. Partecipavi ad una conferenza su un altro 11 settembre, l'11 settembre del 1973, il giorno famoso del golpe cileno di Pinochet. In quell'occasione avevi assunto una di quelle posizioni che noi in Europa definiremmo anti-americane. Quella mattina dell'11 settembre invece hai cambiato idea. Come mai?
On the night of September the 10th, 2001, I was giving a speech. I was giving the Henry Jackson Memorial Lecture at his old college in Washington State. I was surprised to be asked to give it because they wanted me to talk about my book, which calls for the indictment and arrest of Henry Kissinger. I shouldn't have been so surprised, really. Henry Jackson always hated Henry Kissinger because it was Kissinger who told Gerald Ford, President Ford, don't have Solzhenitsyn to the White House. It might upset Brezhnev. And who said he wasn't interested in freeing the Jews of the Soviet Union because it could upset détente. He was what they say a realist now. Yeah. This was his realpolitik. So I also knew that on the 11th of September 2001, in federal court right here in Washington, a Chilean family, the family of General Schneider, former head of the Chilean General Staff, who had been murdered on Henry Kissinger's orders as part of the preparation for the coup against Allende. They were going to file a suit against Henry Kissinger, which is still active, by the way.
Really?
Yes. I knew this was then a secret. I ended my speech by saying tomorrow, September the 11th, 2001, will be remembered for many years as a great day in the struggle for human rights. Okay? And I went to bed. Applause. I signed a lot of books. I felt terrific. My wife woke me up. She was 3 hours ahead. I said, you better turn on the television right now. Well, the difference for me is, in some ways, a difference or distinction without a difference. In Chile, on the 11th of September 1973, the United States helped to remove an elected government and destroy a democratic system and replace it with a very odious form of military dictatorship, as it had done in Greece, in Indonesia, in Brazil, in Uruguay, and many other places, in Cyprus. In my lifetime, and my book about Henry Kissinger was in effect a study of this record of criminality and illegality. What could be better than to partly at least begin to make up for this by removing the fascist totalitarian dictatorship and replacing it with an election? Now, some people, to me that observation is fairly simple. I often, just to try to be funny, I make it seem simpler than it is. Yeah. But I have no respect for anyone who thinks that the two operations are the same thing. And I think that the efforts of some of us on the left over the years has had an effect in Washington in showing that it's not just wrong, but in the long run irrational to place a bet on the survival of dictatorial systems. That actually one should always, however risky it may seem, place the bet on the other side and make the effort on the other side and find one's friends on the other side. And I've lived to see at least some success for that worldview, but as a result of which most people think I've taken leave of my senses.
Maybe I'm too sympathetic to your points, but...
Yes, it's possible.
Yeah, but...
Your questions are too soft.
Yeah, well, I mean...
They are.
I'm not...
But it makes a nice change.
Yeah. So, talking about your last book.
Adesso vorrei parlare del tuo ultimo libro. Hai scritto che Thomas Jefferson è stato il precursore della dottrina Bush.
Yes. I believe that if you study the work and the career of Thomas Jefferson, you can see that he regarded the American Revolution as embracing principles that were universal. They were not just for the United States. He hoped that they would spread or be spread. He thought they would spread because they made sense. They believed in the separation of powers, guarantees of rights, written constitution, secularism, and democracy. And of course, in that way, they did spread. But he thought that it wouldn't just be automatic, that in many cases the United States would have to exert itself on their side, as he was prepared to do in South America, which was still then part of the Spanish Empire. He was a friend of Tadeusz Kościuszko in Poland, for example, at a time when there was a great struggle against Russian domination. And he was a great protector of Thomas Paine, who again believed in the export of revolution. Usually, in Paine's case, Paine preferred it to be exported by French rather than American force, but either would do. In one particular case, Jefferson took a decision that I think is of great importance. In fact, his first real decision as president, which was to send the first American force overseas that ever was sent, in order to put down an Islamic slaveholding system in North Africa, the North African division of the Ottoman Empire. Known to history as the Barbary States, we would now say Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia. Commanding the Straits of Gibraltar, the approach to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. They took, we believe, about 1.5 million slaves, European and American slaves, between 1750 and 1820. Largely forgotten by history, and they claimed the right of the Quran to do it, as well as to take the commerce, the ships, and either to employ them as slaves or to have them as hostages for redemption, and in the meantime to charge protection money for any ship using these. Well, Jefferson said we will not compromise with it, but the European countries all paid the tribute. for their own ships and encouraged them to attack other people's instead. Jefferson said, no, we will force free trade into the Mediterranean at gunpoint, and we will put down the slaveholders, which he did. The first time the Stars and Stripes is ever planted is in Tripoli by a Marine lieutenant named O'Banion, an Irishman. And the first time that Europeans become aware that there's such a thing as the American fleet and that it can cross the Atlantic and it means business. He didn't exactly call for regime change in these countries. I don't think America was strong enough to do that, but he insisted on regime behavior change, regime policy change, and was willing to bombard them for it.
Right.
Now, I think this means, without being too idealistic about the growth of American hegemony, that even at its worst, and I mean things like the bombing of Dresden, say, in that, it has within itself still somehow the germ of a different society. Even at its worst, and I would then add the conquest of the Philippine Islands, of the Spanish-American War of 1899, very brutal process. In some ways not really justifiable, but it's, I think, a fairly sure thing the Philippines are better off now than they would have been if the Spanish Empire had continued. And
so maybe even in Santiago?
One doesn't have to, well, in Santiago de Chile,
yeah.
I would be very reluctant to say so, but it would be, but I will point something out all the same, or I will admit something that I wouldn't have wanted to admit at the time. I know Isabel Allende a little bit. I wrote the introduction, actually, to her novel in English. And I've read her essays as well. She said recently, you know, nobody would try now to propose my uncle's economic program again. No one would try it.
Sure.
We even knew at the time probably it was stupid. And yes, you could say that some of the virtues of the free market economy, but those who support these ideas presumably do not want it said that you can't get them without 25 years of fascist dictatorship, I mean, and torture and disappearance. I presume that's not what they mean. Yeah. So that's why I say one mustn't be naive about the cost of American hegemony to the world has been very high, and it involves various criminal and indefensible episodes, including some that, like Dresden, that people would prefer not to mention ever. But if you take the very long view, there are people sitting now, just where we are, just like we are, in China, in Belarus, in Burkina Faso, so on, wishing that they could have a Jeffersonian Bill of Rights.
Yeah, for sure.
And a secular state. It would be a huge improvement for them. And of course, to say nothing of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and elsewhere. I can't think of anywhere in the world where the simple elements of this model would not be a huge improvement. Particularly, I think, the separation of religion from state. So that what I mean to say, and it's by exercise of irony of history, if you like, partly Hegelian and partly Marxist. As it happens, the American Revolution is the only revolution that still has any appeal or any potential in the world. It's the only revolution left standing. And that is not what anyone on the left would have predicted 50 years ago.
What can we do?
Che cosa possiamo fare per provocare la rivoluzione in quei paesi senza ricorrere all'uso delle armi?
Military means.
According to Said Eddin Ibrahim, who's the moral leader of the democracy movement in Egypt, and was for a while its exemplary political prisoner, a man of great authority in the region, a very admirable man, who I've met twice and spoken with on public platforms. The process of unfreezing the Middle East began with the removal of Saddam Hussein, the kicking out of the keystone in the arch. He says he was not at first in favor, but he has to admit that it has begun a new era, comparable, he says, to the dynamic effect of the French, the Bonapartists landing in Egypt in 1798. Walid Jumblat, the leader of the Lebanese Socialist Party and one of the organizers of the coalition that reclaimed the sovereignty of Lebanon from Syria and held a proper election, says the same thing. And he, in the past, has been very much more anti-American than certainly than Dr. Ibrahim. It's a matter of recognizing objective reality. As it happens, these ideas could have come from anywhere, but they come from America, and they're brought into the region by American force. It's not the perfect solution. But the existing status quo was, in fact, not sustainable. It was going to break down, and if there had not been intervention, the forces in the best position to take advantage would have been local and sectarian ones. Excuse me. In other words, if there were not American forces in Iraq and British forces and UN forces in Iraq, coalition forces, the Saddam Hussein regime was disintegrating. And when Iraq imploded, there would have been an invasion, all right, but it would have been from Turkey in one direction, from Iran in the other, and from Saudi Arabia. And that would have been something horrible to behold. And it would have meant that Iraq would be now to the region what Congo is to Africa, a vortex, a black hole that draws in all the forces of chaos and aggression, violence. The number of deaths from violence would have been huge, from disease and lack of medicine and from chaos would have been very great. And it would have been very hard to stop it, and would have had to be undertaken under much worse circumstances. Some years down the road, and the United Nations would then say, we have to do something about Iraq. And then they would turn to the United States and say, you know, you're going to have to do it, because they always have to do that. What if we had not disgraced ourselves in Rwanda? What if we had decided to do something? We had the warnings from the UN commander on the scene. We know they were received, the communiques from General Dallaire. We know that Kofi Annan got them. We know that we knew everything we needed to know. We knew even not just the day, but the hour when the genocide was supposed to begin. What if we decided to stop it? If the UN had decided to make a stand, which country of the Security Council, which member state would have been given the mandate?
China? To
provide the planes, to provide the heavy lifting planes that can bring, you know, a hospital in one go to a place? Whose troops would have had to stand between the refugees and the Hutu killing squads, death squads? You know exactly who. So I think a part of the reason for anti-Americanism, by the way, is not just this hypocrisy, but it's what produces hypocrisy, which is one of the things, envy, really, jealousy.
Cosa pensi del principio tipicamente americano del destino manifesto?
No, I don't. Not as expressed. That seems to me to be a form of American nationalism, to do with the, if you like, the historical inevitability of there being one state on this continent, possibly a little larger than it is. Jefferson, for example, would have expected Canada to have been conquered by now, and wouldn't have been surprised to find that Cuba was a member state of the United States. That would have seemed natural to him. Not as a colony, but as a full member. Who's to say that wouldn't have been better than what we did have? Semi-colony. And all the bad consequences of that. That would be the case, you see, whatever system of government America had chosen. But to say that there's something universal about the American Revolution is quite different from Manifest Destiny, because it's not based on the geopolitics of North America. So I'm uncomfortable with a slogan that seems to suggest that God is on the side of some new empire, because, well, for one thing, there's no God.
Mi pare tu stia scrivendo un libro su questo tema. Si intitola God is not great, in italiano Dio non è grande. Il sottotitolo è The Case Against Religion, argomenti contro la religione.
No, please, feel free. If there was no other question involved in the episodes we've been discussing, it would still seem to me of the first importance to realize that the The real battle is between secularism and religious fanaticism of all kinds. And that this is an enormously important front in that battle, and that if there's one thing that is left of the culture of the left, the contribution of the left history, it must be that of the Enlightenment and the spread of Enlightenment ideas. One cannot be neutral about these things. And we can't take them for granted either, the gains we have owed to the Enlightenment, and that they need to be defended. And that they're being attacked at their very foundation by jihadists and by supporters of caliphate. I've tried, I've argued this with almost every leading member of the anti-war movement, so-called, and I've never been able to see how a leftist can take any but one position on this, or a liberal. That's first and most important. After that, there may be a lot to quarrel about, but to recognize that it is an enemy and it must be defeated should not be controversial, and yet I can't get people to agree even to that first principle. And this strikes me as very dangerous. There's something of a death wish involved here, I think. So I sometimes fear. People in a way are tired, bored of their society, of their life. They don't think it's worth fighting for. In a way, they find the idea of contemplating its destruction in a boring way, an alienated, anomic way, enjoyable. They secretly want it to happen. It's a very dangerous symptom, I think.
Do you think that, because in Europe there is a lot of...
In Europa ci preoccupiamo molto per il fondamentalismo cristiano degli Stati Uniti. Thomas Jefferson diceva che ci deve essere un muro di separazione tra lo Stato e la Chiesa. Pensi che questo tipo di fondamentalismo cristiano sia una minaccia per la democrazia americana?
Do you think that it's really a threat for the American democracy?
I think that the threat of American Christian, usually Baptist fundamentalism, or at any rate of Protestant evangelicalism, is often overstated for propaganda purposes. Because people like Jerry Falwell, for example, are not actually very dangerous. But they are very easy figures to ridicule, and they always get publicity. But people like Pat Robertson, for example, would be the same. By the way, both of these gentlemen regarded September the 11th, 2001 as a punishment on the United States. They agree with the left that the United States brought this on itself. And that's exactly where that mentality should be confined and should remain. It should be left to them. But I didn't feel particularly offended by them saying that, because I don't take them very seriously. More insidious, I think, is the attempt to challenge the claims of science. In particular, not Darwinism, as its opponents call it, but the theory of evolution, which we happen to know is a sufficient explanation for the natural order, which in turn means that the God hypothesis is not necessary, it's optional. This is very dangerous, and the view of some people, some of them in the armed forces, that what we are fighting is not a war against fundamentalism, but a war for it. Those who say, yes, this is a call for Christian soldiers to resist. That would be the single worst and most dangerous conclusion to draw from this.
Nel 2004 hai detto che avresti votato su un solo tema, il tema del fascismo islamico, e quindi in quell'occasione hai votato Bush. Chi vorresti adesso alla Casa Bianca?
I don't care who is the occupant of the White House in 2008 as long as they have made a promise to draw the line and say that bin Ladenism or its surrogates will never take power in Iraq or retake it in Afghanistan. I'm presuming that that issue will not have been decided by 2008. I expect this war to be going on for the rest of my life, and probably well into the life of my son, my oldest son. That will again be the only thing I care about. It is possible that there could be a Democrat who would say that, and it's even possible that it would be my least favorite Democrat, Mrs. Clinton. It's possible, and that she could be held to it. In that case, I'd happily give her my vote. But I worry very much that it's not a question of the fortitude of the candidates, but the fortitude of the American electorate, which is being constantly undermined by a permanent drizzle of propagandistic reporting, fatalism of various kinds, and demoralization. Therefore, for me, the permanent battle is one for public opinion, not for the executive mansion.
Okay, it's great for me.
And I think it will, I hope that it will, be decided by the nature of the enemy.
Yeah.
There are some people with whom, you know, if public opinion was asked, well, wouldn't it be better if we could make peace with them, they would say yes. But if you can't, and if they won't have it, well, then that's pure idealism. And so I suspect that that's, I have a feeling that's the situation in this case. It's not, there isn't coexistence with religious fanaticism is not, in my opinion, desirable, but it's certainly impossible. So maybe I should be glad it's impossible because it's not desirable, but it is in any case not possible to coexist with an ideology or a system of that kind.
Okay.
You would think it would be a pleasure to be fighting against it.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
excuse me.
please, prego.
Drink.
No, go ahead.
Look in the camera for a moment.
Che cosa pensi di Oriana Fallaci?
It's too emotional.
Yeah.
And too self-centered. But there's something I always find very alarming, which is when people become obsessed with hygiene and with birth rate, and they start, in effect, writing about people as if they were another species. They're dirty and they breed too fast. This is always a mistake. I mean, something's gone wrong in your mentality. And she's obsessed with it, it seems to me.
Proprio lunedì a New York ha tenuto un discorso ed è stata premiata dalla rivista Front Page di David Horowitz.
Well, exactly, you see. I mean, these people are reactionary in a sense. I mean,
she belongs to the left. I mean,
does she still? I don't know.
Ma guarda che lei dice di essere di sinistra, rivendica di essere una donna di
I
sinistra.
suppose that's still true if it means anything. So I didn't like the tone of what she wrote about Italy, though I have to say I know exactly what she means. And there's going to be a lot of regret, I think, for the way in which immigration was encouraged for the wrong reasons. In other words, we wanted the cheapest ones, and we wanted them fast. And this is probably going to turn out to have been a huge mistake. And again, people don't like to, well, they don't like to admit the mistake, and also they hate, above all, they hate the idea they're not multicultural. They can't stand the...
Yeah, for sure.
So her challenge to that is interesting in itself, and of course it's outrageous that anyone should try and shut her up.
Tu hai parlato di Salman Rushdie e di Martin Amis, ma c'è anche un altro tuo amico, Ian McEwan. Che cosa pensi del suo romanzo Saturday?
His most successful. I thought it was excellent because I thought he captured very well, and indeed he partly is himself an example of the schizophrenia of the liberal type. There are two Ian McEwans. There always have been in his books. And in this case, he really had to bring them into quite close alignment, and it's always the guy's always on a knife edge. Yeah. He can't quite make up his mind. So it's a very interesting study of, and anyway, it's in other ways a study of the brain. I thought it was a very daring attempt, and I think it was also his way of working out what he did feel. Not in quite the same way as myself, but I think he has come down on the side of Mr. Blair. When Laura Bush went to dinner at Downing Street, she and the President were guests of the Blairs about a year and a half ago. Mr. Blair asked her, did she want to have anyone invited to dinner? And she said yes, she would like to have Ian McEwan and Tom Stoppard.
Really?
Yes. But they both went too. I know they both. Yeah, they both went. They both said she was great.
And
I don't think the President knew who they were.
Però a Bush è molto piaciuto l'ultimo romanzo di Tom Wolfe, I Am Charlotte Simmons.
The Tom Wolfe last novel. It's weird.
Because I think it must be true that the president is at least partly dyslexic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's his problem. People are wrong in thinking he's stupid. He's not. But he's very uncultured in one way. He doesn't read, and probably cannot read just for pleasure.
Yeah.
He reads only for functional stuff, and not very well. It's a disaster. I mean, it's something to sympathize with.
Yeah.
But I've made a study of it at one point. I think that's what his problem is. He doesn't recognize the words he hears. When he sees them on the page, he doesn't make the connection, which is a tragedy. A lot of people have it a little bit. I think he has it quite badly. But it has the effect, as a lot of disabilities do, of making you very easy to understand. Because even when Bush's sentences are completely chaotic, they're absolutely easy. Everyone knows what he means, and in fact, they do the work for him. They give that extra bit of attention. Say, well, what's he trying to say? And then they work it out. Well, then it stays with them. He's actually been able to make an advantage of it. Although people don't realize this because they're so snobbish. Yeah. And they're so patronizing about Texas. Mezzogiorno.
Yeah.
Where are you from?
Io sono siciliano, ma vivo a Milano.
My great ambition is to go to Sicily.
Really?
Yeah. I've never been.
E come mai ti piace così tanto la Sicilia?
I don't know. And I'm very interested in Magna Graecia.
In?
Magna Graecia.
Magna Graecia, yeah.
So it's an amateur interest, but I can't believe I've never made it.
Next time.
I've read some of Leonardo Sciascia.
Yeah.
Sciascia è il mio eroe intellettuale.
Yeah. Is he still with us? No.
No, è morto nel 1987.
Yeah.
Che ci devo fare? A me Christopher Hitchens piace moltissimo, come avete visto è uno molto di sinistra in tutti i suoi aspetti, dalla casa, dall'aspetto, dalle cose che dice, e poi alla fine invece è quello che più efficacemente sostiene l'idea di democratizzare il Medio Oriente e di dare una nuova opportunità a quei popoli oppressi dalla dittatura.